أعلن افتتاح جلسة مجلس الأمن
The 8,988th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Ms. Catherine Russell, Executive Director of the United Nations Children's Fund. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and congratulations on presiding over this Council in these extraordinary times. We're here, of course, to speak about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, and yet none of us want to be here today. We already had enough on our hands, many other unnecessary and unwanted conflicts leaving misery in their wake. We had no need for another war, which would have such a swift and sweeping impact for what Filippo Grandi has called the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. Today, indeed, is not a day we had in mind. In the weeks before the military offensive began in Ukraine, and despite the din of commentary and rhetoric and prediction, humanitarian organizations went about their business. They've been working in the Donbass region, providing 1.5 million people there with humanitarian aid, a business they have been doing quietly and without fanfare these past 8 years. And they're doing it still today, however and whenever they can. But of course, the humanitarian agencies, also prepared for worse to come. 2 weeks ago, few thought the scenario in which we find ourselves today, one of such intense conflict, was thinkable. It was essentially unplannable from the humanitarian operational perspective, and yet that humanitarian community did plan. We looked to the possible numbers with the UNHCR and IOM and our NGO partners at Unicef and WFP. We estimated together who might be in need, who might be on the move, all those vulnerable people who might need help at home. We looked at possible routes and methods of delivery. The World Food Programme mobilized its considerable logistics to get supply chains up and running from a standing start. We knew that this operation would need the best of talent, and all humanitarian agencies, and including my office, sent in surge staff in the days before that offensive began. And as the unthinkable became the reality, the UN and its humanitarian partners started a scalable and agile, adaptable and resilient humanitarian operation fit for the changing situation. They started it. The Secretary General, at record speed, appointed Amin Awad, a person of the widest experience of fast-moving operations, including in that very region, as his crisis coordinator. Amin, supported by Osnat Lubrani, the experienced resident and humanitarian coordinator, is in Ukraine as we meet here today. In the first days of the offensive, our staff, like so many in Ukraine, spent their days and nights working from bunkers and basements. Yet they managed to produce the two robust response plans which Filippo and I launched last week in Geneva to a very generous donor response. Madam President, do I need to describe what we have all seen and heard on the news? Simply put, millions of lives shattered. People can't stay home with shops shut, power and water cut, shells falling, phones switched off. They can't find what they need, even if they have money to pay for it. And as we have seen, even as the TV cameras roll, many can't flee in safety either in this conflict. It's been 11 days of escalating violence, fear, and pain. As of 6th of March, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights reported at least 1,207 civilian casualties, including at least 406 dead, and I guess the real figure could be considerably higher. UNHCR reports that more than 1.7 million refugees have fled, and that figure is probably out of date already, in 11 days. Madam President, humanitarian assistance has continued in areas where security permits. Under the leadership of the crisis coordinator and the resident and humanitarian coordinator in country, we have new plans now, of course, on how to deliver where humanitarian needs are most acute. This includes the cities that we have seen so much on these last days, such as Mariupol, Kharkiv, Kherson. Our response is being scaled up from hubs in Vinnytsia, Uzhhorod, and Lviv. The UN and our partners, and we will hear, I'm sure, from Kathy in a minute, have already provided food to hundreds of thousands. The World Food Programme is setting up supply chain operations to deliver immediate food and cash assistance to 3 to 5 million people inside Ukraine. WHO has shipped trauma care, emergency surgery commitment, and other supplies that will help in days to come, thousands of people, and more supplies are on their way. HCR is providing assistance, albeit as a small scale at the moment, through a network of shops and supermarkets in Mariupol in collaboration with NGOs. MSF never left. It's training trauma surgeons, providing support for the people in that city. It's bringing in thousands, UNHCR is bringing in thousands of blankets, mattresses, and other non-food items from Poland. Thank you to Poland, and shipping them to transit centres. And we're going to hear, and I look forward to hearing a lot more about the experience of children from Kathy, from the vital work of Unicef and its partners. The Ukrainian Red Cross has distributed humanitarian assistance to thousands via its emergency stockpiles, including hygiene and food kits, warm clothing and medicine. And I would like to take the chance here to salute the more than 4,000 Ukraine Red Cross volunteers across the country, used to conflict, of course, the community workers also of local NGOs, the truck drivers carrying basic necessities into volatile areas. These are people all in harm's way who have no hesitation in carrying out their mission. Madam President, I see 3 immediate priorities to lessen the pain and suffering we're all watching unfold in real time. First, the parties need to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian homes and infrastructure in their military operations. This includes allowing safe passage for civilians to leave areas of active hostilities on a voluntary basis in the direction they choose. All civilians, whether they stay or leave, must be respected and protected. Second, we need safe passage for humanitarian supplies into areas of active hostilities. Civilians in places like Mariupol, Kharkiv, Melitopol, and elsewhere desperately need aid, especially life-saving medical supplies, the kind that have been brought in these past days by WHO. Many modalities are possible, but it must take place in line with the parties' obligation under the laws of war. And thirdly, we urgently need a system of constant communication with the parties to the conflict and assurances to enable the delivery of humanitarian aid. And we have seen these systems in place in other countries, of course, as you know well. A humanitarian notification system, as we term it, can support delivery of aid at the scale needed. I have already conveyed these 3 points to the authorities of Ukraine and to the Russian Federation. And on the third point, thanks to the cooperation with the Russian Federation, my office has sent a team to Moscow to work on better humanitarian civil-military coordination that can allow us to scale up, precisely to begin to establish a humanitarian notification system. This follows last Friday's phone call between the Secretary General and the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Sergei Shoigu. UN teams have held the first technical meeting with the representatives of the Ministry of Defense. I welcome cooperation by both sides and sincerely hope to see further progress in the hours ahead. Madam President, people are watching as this unnecessary conflict engulfs cities and civilians. As well as what's happening in Ukraine, they have an extra sense of dread over the impact this will have on the wider world. I include myself in this category. I'm deeply worried about the consequences on vulnerable people living half a world away. Food prices are spiking, supplies are uncertain. We didn't need that either. People in the Sahel, in Yemen, the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, Madagascar, and already face profound food insecurity. Record-level fuel prices means life becomes harder still in places like Lebanon, where generators keep hospitals open and water treatment plants working. And the extraordinary generosity, which I welcome and praise, of donors to the launch of the regional plan and the Ukraine humanitarian response plan. We hope that this will not divert those donors from other pressing humanitarian crises. This may be the latest one, but not the only one. So while we have planned, we have mobilized, we have fundraised to meet the challenge we face, we have the capacity and I think the know-how to meet the most urgent needs in Ukraine on the basis of cooperation with the parties. But, and here I would like to stress this particular last point, make no mistake, we are unable to meet the needs of civilians today. All those points that I have made are points in preparation, in supply, in redeployment, in getting to the right place. But we're failing to meet the needs of civilians today at this time. I hope we will not fail them tomorrow. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Griffith for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Catherine Russell.
Excellencies and colleagues, my appreciation to Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and Ambassador Ferhat Hoxha for convening today's meeting. I would also like to thank Ambassador Nuseja from the United Arab Emirates for hosting this briefing during your Security Council presidency. This is my first time briefing the Security Council as Unicef Executive Director. I regret that it has been made necessary by the rapidly worsening situation in Ukraine and the unconscionable impact the conflict is having on Ukraine's children. The past 8 years of conflict in Ukraine have already inflicted profound and lasting harm to children. With the escalation of this conflict, the immediate and very real threat to Ukraine's 7.5 million children has grown. Homes, schools, orphanages, and hospitals have all come under attack. Civilian infrastructure like water and sanitation facilities have been hit, leaving millions without access to safe water. For many, life has moved underground as families seek safety in shelters, subways, or basements, often for hours on end. Women are giving birth in makeshift maternity wards with limited medical supplies. Most stores are closed, making it hard for people to buy essential items, including basic necessities for children like diapers and medication. And even if stores were open, millions of people are too afraid to venture outside for food or water because of continuous shelling and shooting. The intensification of the armed conflict is posing severe human costs, which are increasing exponentially by the day. As of today, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights recorded 1,207 civilian casualties in Ukraine. Since February 24, at least 27 children have been killed and 42 children have been wounded. Countless more have been severely traumatized. As the fighting has now reached densely populated areas and across the country, we expect child casualties to increase. We also expect the displacement crisis to continue growing rapidly. As of yesterday, UNHCR was reporting in excess of 1.7 million refugees fleeing to hosting countries. Half of the people on the move are children. UNICEF is working closely with UNHCR to reach them with protection and assistance in receiving countries. I've just returned from Romania-Ukraine border, where thousands of women and children traveled to escape the fighting. I met with mothers and children who had to flee their homes at a moment's notice. They told me how it felt to leave everything they know behind, to leave husbands, fathers, and elderly loved ones, not knowing when or if they would see each other again. The children talked about being suddenly pulled out of school, of losing beloved toys, and the terrifying sound of shelling and gunfire. So many children have been deeply traumatized. Excellencies, UNICEF and our partners are working 24 hours a day to meet rapidly escalating humanitarian needs in Ukraine and in neighboring countries. From trucking in safe water for drinking and hygiene, providing emergency medical services, and providing shelter and protection for those displaced from their homes. At present, we have some 135 people working for UNICEF in Ukraine, and we are sending more to meet needs in country. UNICEF-supported child protection mobile teams are reaching children wherever they can with psychosocial care, mental health support, and protection services. The operating environment in Ukraine is extremely complex. Access constraints and rapidly changing front lines make it much more difficult to deliver critical supplies and services. The safety and well-being of our staff on the ground remains a top priority. I also want to spotlight our local partners and other local humanitarian actors who continue to operate under extremely difficult security conditions, especially those working in the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts, regions that have been hard hit over the past several weeks. I'm very glad to tell you that on Sunday, UNICEF delivered 40 tons of medical life-saving items for children and mothers to 22 hospitals in 5 of the most affected regions. This equipment included midwifery and obstetrics kits, resuscitation and surgical kits, oxygen concentrators for shelters, hospitals, and first aid kits for frontline workers, enough to meet the needs of 20,000 children and their mothers. In coordination with the Ministry of Health, UNICEF is assessing further needs and preparing other shipments. UNICEF and our partners need flexible resources and safe, uninterrupted access to rapidly scale up our efforts to meet children's urgent needs, wherever they are, whether still in Ukraine or on the move. In collaboration with UNHCR, we have deployed teams to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and the Republic of Slovakia, and built on our ongoing presence in Romania, Moldova, and Belarus to support the urgent needs of children. We've begun operating Blue Dot safe spaces in hosting countries at border crossings where children are first registered. The hubs provide a one-stop safe space for children and their families. They offer a range of services, including places for children to play, psychosocial support, basic legal counseling, recreational kits, and hygiene products. I visited one of these last week. Staff at these hubs are also able to identify unaccompanied and separated children. Children without parental care are at a heightened risk of violence, abuse, and exploitation. When these children are moved across borders, the risks are multiplied. The risk of trafficking also soars in emergencies. UNICEF and UNHCR have urged all hosting countries to take measures to identify and register unaccompanied and separated children fleeing Ukraine after allowing them access to their country. Temporary foster care and other community-based care provided through a government system can help protect children who have been displaced without their families. But we want to stress that adoption should never occur during or immediately after emergencies. Every effort should be made to reunify children with their families. Inside Ukraine, UNICEF is also deeply concerned about the safety and well-being of the nearly 100,000 children, half of them with disabilities, who live in institutions and boarding schools. We have received reports of institutions understandably seeking to move children to safety in neighboring countries and beyond. Many of these children and for living relatives or legal guardians. All of these children have the right to be protected. While we recognize that humanitarian evacuations may become necessary to save lives, special measures must be taken to contact relatives and obtain consent to move these children to safety and to reunify them with their families when the threat is past. With the spread of the conflict, we should all be extremely concerned about the risk posed to children by landmines and explosive remnants of war. Even prior to the recent escalation, eastern Ukraine was one of the most mine-contaminated stretches of land in the world. This brutal reality is rapidly extending to other parts of the country. We will continue doing everything we can for children in Ukraine. We are committed to stay and deliver, but we need your support. Excellencies, what is happening to children in Ukraine is a moral outrage. Images of a mother and her 2 children and a friend lying dead on the street, hit by a mortar as they tried to flee to safety, must shock the conscience of the world. We must act to protect children from this brutality. UNICEF calls upon the members of this council to remind all parties of their legal and moral obligation to protect children and spare them from attack. We remain extremely concerned about attacks on the civilian infrastructure necessary to help children weather this conflict, including schools, hospitals, water and sanitation facilities, and critical energy infrastructure. We call on all parties to refrain from fighting near or targeting these protected areas and from cyber attacks that can disrupt critical services for children and families. We appeal to all parties to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, including cluster munitions, which pose the gravest risk of harm to children. And we urge all parties to protect civilians from further harm related to contamination from landmines and explosive remnants of war. UNICEF respectfully asks this council to send a strong message to all parties of their obligation to ensure the safety of humanitarian personnel and equipment and to permit and facilitate our work. This also means ensuring that sanctions and other restrictive measures do not impede humanitarian action. Finally, we have renewed our call for an immediate suspension of ongoing military actions in Ukraine. We need a ceasefire and adequate guarantees to enable safe and rapid humanitarian access to all people in need across Ukraine. This will allow critical humanitarian assistance and protection to reach those in need and to let families in those most affected areas venture out to get food and water, seek medical care, and leave their homes to find safety. In closing, I would like to emphasize that UNICEF is a humanitarian actor abiding by humanitarian principles. Over the past 8 years, UNICEF has been working on both sides of the line of contact in eastern Ukraine, and we are committed to providing humanitarian assistance and protection to all children in need across Ukraine and in neighboring countries. But this brutality must come to an end. Excellencies, colleagues, children in Ukraine need help and protection. They need supplies and other critical support. They need access to basic social services like health and education. They need hope for the future. But above all, children in Ukraine need peace. It is the only sustainable solution. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
I thank Ms. Russell for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Executive Director Russell. At your first briefing to the Council, we welcome you to this setting. And thank you also to Undersecretary General Griffiths. Both of your briefings were extraordinarily sobering, but we very much appreciate the work that you do. I also want to say that we're so appreciative and so proud and grateful to UNICEF and OCHA and other humanitarian agencies staff on the ground in Ukraine and throughout the region. We've seen the images of them coordinating deliveries from bomb shelters and continuing to provide assistance to the Ukrainian people under difficult and dangerous conditions. They are a testament to the life-saving work of the UN's humanitarian agencies and your indispensable role helping vulnerable civilians suffering the consequences of war. We're outraged by increased reports of Moscow's attacks harming Ukrainian civilians in its unprovoked and unjustified war against the Ukrainian people. President Putin's war of choice has already turned 500,000 children into refugees. Already more than 1.7 million civilians have fled Ukraine into surrounding countries, and this doesn't include those who have been internally displaced. We've seen the images of elderly fleeing, a woman killed in her wheelchair, children dying in their mother's arms, and a woman being rushed bleeding to a hospital. These are the images that we're seeing daily of what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. Last week, I had the opportunity to speak to my counterparts from Romania, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Moldova, where their governments, international organizations, and NGOs have been working nonstop to welcome all those who are fleeing. What I heard was staggering. My Polish colleague, who's sitting in the room with us today, shared that 100 refugees are crossing into Poland every minute. 100 a minute. Just do the math. We talked about many of the challenges these neighboring countries are facing and how the United States can help keep their borders open to all those seeking international protection, including those who may experience communication barriers with border agents due to disabilities or other factors. We're committed to providing support, and we know that their needs will only increase if Russia does not cease its violence. We know this because of what we've seen over the last week, from the reckless attack on Europe's largest nuclear power plant, to the siege of cities across Ukraine, to the tragic images and alarming reports from those who are unable to leave Ukraine to seek safety. The world is haunted by these images of homes, hospitals, schools, orphanages being destroyed, demolished in front of our eyes. Child cancer patients unable to receive chemotherapy, babies delivered in basements instead of maternity wards, and hundreds of thousands of civilians without access to electricity for heat or drinking water to stay alive. Ukrainian cities are under siege, under relentless Russian shelling. Hospitals are running out of supplies, food is dwindling, and civilian casualties are mounting while the most vulnerable group, those with disabilities, the elderly, children, continue to bear the brunt of suffering. We have seen besiegement before, from Leningrad to Aleppo. These are tragedies of immense proportions. The United States is closely coordinating with the government of Ukraine, neighboring countries, and international organizations, including those within the UN system, to monitor the situation, and we will work with them to address humanitarian needs both in Ukraine and in the region. While we are heartened by the international community's pledges of over $1.5 billion in humanitarian support so far, we know that as long as Russia pursues its relentless and brutal campaign, the need for assistance will only increase. We all need to ensure these pledged funds are flexible and mobilized as quickly as possible, given the escalating needs on the ground. But perhaps most important of all, we must heed the call we heard today from the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. That means a sustained pause in hostilities to allow the safe passage of civilians who wish to leave areas of active conflict, the safe passage of humanitarian supplies, and the free and safe movement of those delivering humanitarian assistance. We need Russia's firm, clear, public, and unequivocal commitment to allow and facilitate immediate, unhindered humanitarian access for humanitarian partners in Ukraine. Very specifically, we call for the Russian Federation to agree to and honor in good faith Ukrainian proposals for time-bound humanitarian safe passage in specific agreed-upon locations. We call for the establishment of a ground-level notification system that will facilitate the safe movement of humanitarian convoys and flights. This is imperative for ensuring humanitarian supplies and commodities can be reliably transported into Ukraine to reach those most in need. I also want to note today that the United States is increasingly concerned about the protection of civilians in this conflict, particularly women and girls who are vulnerable to gender-based violence, LGBTQI Ukrainians, as well as Ukraine's population of older adults and people with disabilities. We also call for the protection and care of all vulnerable children, including separated and unaccompanied children and those in institutional care. Children should never be involved in conflict, period. Children should never be involved in conflict. They must be protected. The humanitarian toll of President Putin's war on Ukraine is mounting. Children are dying. People are fleeing their homes. And for what? As UNICEF has reported, we know already that dozens of children have been killed in Putin's war. And as we work to confirm cases, we know the actual numbers are actually far greater. Young children have also been severely traumatized by the violence and destruction. They've witnessed so many things to the point that they've stopped speaking. The physical and psychological wounds of this war will be long-lasting. It's clear Mr. Putin has a plan to destroy and terrorize Ukraine. If the last 2 weeks have shown us anything, it's that the Ukrainian people are not going to give up. And many Russian people themselves, including many Russian soldiers, do not want this war. Unfortunately, Mr. Putin doesn't seem to be listening, and we are concerned that the world needs to be prepared for a very long and very difficult road ahead. The Ukrainians are defending themselves bravely, and we will continue to stand with them and support them. But President Putin is clearly willing to sacrifice the lives of thousands of Russian soldiers to achieve his personal ambitions. We have been warning Moscow for weeks that in the end, Russia will be weaker and not stronger for launching this war. This is already proving true. The question is how much devastation President Putin is willing to wreak for this enormous mistake. We continue to call on Russia to change course, withdraw its forces, de-escalate through diplomacy, and we support Ukraine's call for a ceasefire. In the meantime, we applaud those doing everything in their power to alleviate the suffering Putin has unleashed on the Ukrainian people. Whatever course Russia's invasion may take, we must do everything, and I stress everything we can to help the people of Ukraine. Kyiv still stands, and we stand with Kyiv. We stand with Ukrainians. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Executive Director Russell, and welcome to the Council. And thank you as well, USG Griffiths, for this sobering and painful briefing. More than that, thank you for everything you and your teams are doing in meeting as much as you can the huge and increasing humanitarian needs in Ukraine. Dear colleagues, today marks the 12th day of the unprovoked and unjustified aggression against Ukraine, a war of choice that is becoming a war of obsession. Like in every day of this senseless war, Ukraine and its brave citizens find themselves in the well-known sickening inevitability of every conflict. Civilians are killed, children are traumatized, and women are suffering. In less than 2 weeks, Russia managed to create, out of nothing and for no reason, the fastest and largest mass refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. We were told that this so-called special operation, the domestic nickname and the new Russian definition for aggression, would not target civilians. In reality, civilians are assaulted and trapped among rubble. Toddlers are sheltering in cellars and subway tunnels. And as we saw last week, nuclear plants are under threat of deliberate or accidental hit. Fueled by anger due to the heroic Ukrainian resistance, civilian population, civilian infrastructure, residential areas, schools and hospitals, as we heard, everything has become a target. Even diplomatic representations are not spared, as it happened today with our own honorary consulate in Kharkiv. Dear colleagues, the huge humanitarian needs across the country are multiplying by the hour. Hundreds of thousands are without safe drinking water because of damage to system infrastructure, and many have been cut off from access to other essential services like health care. More than 1 million people are on the move, searching for shelter and safety, including in neighboring countries. Families have been walking long distances in freezing temperatures to find shelter, most of them in neighboring countries. Half of them are children. We applaud the way Poland, Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia have responded in welcoming and sheltering hundreds of thousands of displaced people. They must not be left alone. The escalating aggression in Ukraine has been terrifying, especially to children. Tens of thousands of children have seen their daily lives and routines shattered. Thousands are separated from their families in shock and desperate for safety. This is what Russia is doing. So I have some very simple, direct questions. What in the world can justify exposing children to such extreme violence and unbearable levels of fear and anxiety? Where is the humanity of a great nation? Where is the responsibility of a great power? Where are the commitments of a permanent member of this body? Does international humanitarian law have still any meaning for Russia today? The answers lie under the blood of innocent Ukrainians. Dear colleagues, Russia's actions are a gross violation of Geneva Conventions and are classified as war crime under the Rome Statute. It must be made clear that if anyone in Russia thinks that what they are doing in Ukraine is a rendezvous with history and get away with atrocities and crimes against humanity, they must think twice. There will be accountability. Albania was among 38 countries to refer Ukraine to the ICC prosecutor. We fully support his work to gather proof and document crimes committed to present them to the court. It is therefore urgent to open secure humanitarian corridors for the safe evacuation of civilians and for the delivery of medicine and food. The Russian side must stop ignoring the appeals of international humanitarian organizations, in particular the International Committee of the Red Cross, to cease fire in order to create safe conditions for the departure of civilians and wounded without discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, or migration status. Differentiation between people on any ground, especially on the basis of race or ethnicity, are legally unjustifiable and morally and ethically unacceptable. Dear colleagues, there is a devastating bloody war on the ground, but there is another nasty war in the background. The latter concerns information. We remain worried about developments within Russia itself regarding freedom of information. With the latest measures taken by the parliament, authorities in Russia have shut down foreign broadcasters whose work becomes impossible under the law which criminalizes independent reporting in the country. The last major local independent broadcasters, TV Drozh and Eko Moskvy Radio, were shut down last week. We know from our own terrible communist past that attacking freedom of information in this way is the first sign of a dictatorship. When a government is afraid of its own people, it has a fundamental problem. Russian citizens have the right to know why their country attacked its neighbor. They need to be informed about the actions of their army against the people of Ukraine. Mothers must know why their sons are dying. And Russians deserve better than doctored propaganda. Otherwise, they would only hear about the fictional Ukrainian genocide in Donbass, which never happened, about Ukraine attacking Russia, which never happened, or about Russia winning the war, which is not happening. Madam President, protection of civilians should remain a top priority. Yet, as bombardments intensify, fueled by the anger caused by the heroic Ukrainian resistance, we are also worried about the destruction of cultural heritage. Indiscriminate bombardments have already destroyed architectural ensembles in Kharkiv and risk inflicting irreparable damage to the Ukrainian cultural heritage widely. Heritage is a testimony of the past, but also a vector of peace for the future, which Russia is assaulting. Let me end with the cry of this woman, Alexandria, living in Kharkiv. This was last week, and I don't know whether she's still alive. She was saying, my city is being shelled, but my mom won't believe me. Her mom, who lives in Russia, would respond to her call that she heard on TV that the Russian army would never target civilians. It's Ukrainians who are killing their own people. Dear colleague, 12 days ago, Ukraine was guilty because it exists. Now they are guilty because they do not surrender. What is tomorrow made of for them? We call on Russia to come to senses and stop. We call on Russia to hold its aggression and go home. The world knows what they are doing. What is happening is a global air raid siren, a warning of how important multilateralism is and how much we need it to work, and how essential it is to make everything possible to stop this war and make the aggressor pay for it. When one behaves like a rogue state, it should not pretend to be treated differently. Albania reaffirms its unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and this position was reiterated today, just a few hours ago, by a resolution adopted by the Albanian Parliament. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement, and I now give the floor for the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We thank Martin Griffiths for his views. We welcome to the meeting the new Executive Director of Unicef, Catherine Russell, and thank her for her report. We wish to note that we've seen the non-bias in Ukraine's reaction to this crisis over its last 8 years of its existence. The fund didn't turn a blind eye to the bombardments of Donbass, to the territory of Donetsk and Lugansk, and the problems for children that came from this in terms of the humanitarian and psychological situation. We hope that this non-biased approach will continue in the future. We think that UNICEF's views should be based on reliable, tried and tested information. We welcome the reflection in the humanitarian plan of the dangerous fact of the mass proliferation on Ukrainian territory of small arms and light weapons, many of which have fallen into the hands of radical elements, including those who have been deliberately freed from prison. The consequences of this irresponsible step by Volodymyr Zelensky, who gave the order, are already clear. The number of civilian victims among civilians from the hands of the radicals is increasing day by day, first and foremost in Kiev. We have been drawing attention to this for a long time. We call on all colleagues in the Security Council to strictly keep in today's meeting to the humanitarian context of the situation in Ukraine. We've already had the opportunity to exchange political views on what's happening, and it's clear that our views diverge from yours, and that you continue to rely on the opinion of Ukrainian politicians and also doubtful or openly mendacious material from social networks in presenting the course and aims of our special operation in Ukraine in an unfavorable light. We once again we agree with the representative of Albania that there is an information war going on, more likely a disinformation war. And we would say that in the West, in the free world, where Russian information resources are being turned off and where any information which contradicts your version of events is not allowed to be broadcast. The permanent representative of the United States today accused us of not complying with our commitments to create safe humanitarian corridors. Let's get down into this. We once again wish to emphasize that safety for civilians in Ukraine is not a problem for Russian, because we're not bombarding them, but rather Ukrainian radicals and neo-Nazis who are holding hostage whole towns and cities and are making use of citizens as a human shield, not allowing them to leave cities despite the fact that there are humanitarian corridors and that Russian units have declared a ceasefire. There are a panoply of examples of this. Thus, on the 4th of March, the Ministry of Defense of Russia and the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, Irina Vereshchuk, agreed parameters for humanitarian corridors from Mariupol to Zaporozhye and from Volnovakha to Dnipropetrovsk. They were supposed to be opened at 10 in the morning on the 5th of March. At Kiev's request, the representatives of the International Red Cross were invited to the areas where these corridors were being opened. Our side was ready to provide wholehearted assistance in guaranteeing safety for the evacuation of these people. We informed the UN Secretariat of all of this in timely fashion. However, the radicals in Mariupol violated this agreement. As is clear from a radio conversation that was intercepted between two commanders of the Nationalist Battalion Azov that is in Volnovakha, the radicals there were told to shoot at the legs of those who were heading for the humanitarian corridors. Those who risked life and limb to try and leave Mariupol, when they reached the checkpoints to exit the city, were shot on sight by Ukrainian Nazis. There's a great deal of video evidence of this. In Mariupol alone, there were some 200,000 civilians who are in the crosshairs of the forces there. And those who are ready the humanitarians who are trying to offer assistance aren't able to get there and to prevent the catastrophe that is developing in the town. The critical situation for people in other regions of the country is they are also blockaded by nationalist battalions. We note that Ukrainian radicals, day by day, are showing their true face more clearly. The local inhabitants have said that they forced out the staff of a maternity clinic and then put a firing site in that clinic. They also completely destroyed one of the nursery schools in the city. In addition, we state officially that Ukrainian authorities have categorically refused to cooperate on evacuating people from Kharkov or Sumy. Considering the catastrophic humanitarian situation and its worsening in Kiev, Kharkov, Sumy and Mariupol, and also the personal request of President Emmanuel Macron to President Putin, the Russian armed forces stated that from 10 a.m. on the 7th of March 2022, there will be a ceasefire and they will open humanitarian corridors from Kiev, Mariupol and Sumy towards Russian territory for those who wish to evacuate through that logistically viable route, but also towards Ukrainian territory. This information was conveyed the evening before to Kiev, to the specialized agencies of the UN, to the OSCE, the ICRC, and other international organizations through all available information resources, including the media. An official answer from Kiev was received only today at 7:10 a.m. at Moscow time, but the open humanitarian corridors towards the Russian Federation were ignored. This subject was raised in her official statement by the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Vereshchuk, who called the proposal to open humanitarian corridors towards Russia, and I quote, absurd and unacceptable, end quote. It is clear to us that the Kiev regime is making use of all available and unavailable methods to wholeheartedly stop the exit of those citizens who wish to leave and also foreigners who wish to go to Russia because they're scared that once these people are free, they will tell the truth about the actions of Ukrainian radicals, as is being done by those people who've been able to get out away from these radicals. We're talking here about threats, intimidation, blackmail, physical violence, and also shooting on sight directed at citizens and also foreigners. By way of illustration, just one statement from the mayor of Sumy, Alexander Lysenko. This was made today together with the commander of a national battalion, and I quote, "There will not be any green corridors, no civilians will leave to Russia, and those who try to will be shot dead." End of quote. In their statements on the impossibility of evacuating Ukrainian citizens towards Russia, Ukrainian officials have ignored the fact that there are already Ukrainian refugees in Russia. From the area of the special military operation, more than 168,000 people have been evacuated to Russia, including 43,469 children. And in the last 24 hours, 5,550 people, including 740 children. The Russian border has been crossed by 19,256 private vehicles, and in the last 24 hours by 900 of them. We are also establishing temporary accommodation points. These are all ready for individual work with citizens, or rather civilians, arriving from Ukraine. Unfortunately, the issue of the evacuation of the population from other regions is also being politicized, as is the issue of humanitarian assistance. In particular, the requests of the Ukrainian party look absurd. These are the requests made to us just less than 3 hours before the opening of humanitarian corridors, asking us to guarantee the evacuation from a number of settlements that are under the control of the Russian armed forces. In this, none of the inhabitants of these inhabited places had said they wanted to evacuate. People were simply living in their houses and they're not threatened by anything. In parallel, we were asked to organize the evacuation of citizens from a number of cities which, for the time being, are under the control of the nationalist battalions. And, of course, we were also asked to provide alleged humanitarian goods from Ukraine to Melitopol and Berdyansk in the Zaporozhye region and in Kherson. This also looks cynical towards the inhabitants of these cities, because at the moment these regions are under the full control of the Russian armed forces, and their populations are continuing to live peacefully and have everything that they need, including humanitarian assistance from Russia, which has arrived to different regions of Ukraine, 500,000 tons of it. Madam President, we are also particularly concerned that the Ukrainian radicals are continuing to hold hostage as human shields more than 1,500 foreigners in a range of cities. We are working around the clock with the relevant diplomatic agencies on this issue. But foreigners are having very severe problems when trying to cross the border, when they're trying to leave towards Europe. We're talking here about citizens from a range of different countries, including African countries. We also draw your attention to a public statement by the Senegalese representative of the African Union on this issue. We are shocked by news of the inhumane attacks by nationalists on student accommodation, which has, among other things, caused the death of Indian students. With regard to the safety of UN personnel in Ukraine, and for us this is one of the priorities, currently the Russian troops have guaranteed the exit from Kiev of 180 UN personnel. When necessary, this support will continue. We are in constant contact with the UN Secretariat. We take a wholeheartedly responsible approach to resolving the humanitarian issues that Ukrainian citizens are facing. On the 2nd of March, on the base of the National Defense Management Center, there was an inter-agency coordination staff created for humanitarian response in connection with the special operation carried out in Ukraine. This is working around the clock. The staff include the authorized representatives of all of the federal bodies of the executive, state corporations and entities of the Russian Federation. The main objective of the staff is to guarantee multifaceted humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainian population in the controlled regions and also in Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, also guaranteeing the safe evacuation of civilians from in Ukraine and other countries. Madam President, I also have to mention another aspect. The deployment of heavy weaponry, including anti-aircraft defense systems, mobile rocket launch systems, bombardment artillery in heavily populated areas. This is not a question of isolated incidents, but it's become a rule for Ukrainian nationalist battalions. The attempts of civilians to protest and to request that this weaponry be removed have brutally been stopped with threats of the use of weapons. The similar cowardice on the part of the combatants using the civilian population as hostages is not just deeply immoral, but also violates the norms of international humanitarian law, including Articles 57 and 58 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Convention of 1949. Furthermore, in a number of cities, in particular in Odessa, it has been recorded that weaponry has been placed near or inside objects of cultural heritage in violation of Article 53 of this additional protocol. The break-off in the evacuation of the civilians from using humanitarian corridors is a violation of Article Article 75 of the additional protocol. And the footage published on social networks of torture and abuse of Russian troops who are being imprisoned is a violation of Article 14 of the Geneva Convention of 1949, which guarantees respect for the person and the dignity of troops under any circumstances. Colleagues, I encourage you to make the correct appraisal of all of these activities. We also expect the same from the UN's leadership. Otherwise, you will be encouraging Ukrainian radicals and neo-Nazis to new crimes. Madam President, in conclusion, I wish to once again firmly encourage our Western colleagues to convince the Ukrainian leadership to think finally about the safety of the Ukrainian and foreign citizens held hostage by radicals, and to join in the work to open and to guarantee the safety of humanitarian corridors. If, of course, you still have any ways to influence the nationalists, we have greater and greater doubts about that. We, for our part, are ready to do such work. Thank you very much.
أشكر ممثل الاتحاد الروسي على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثلة إيرلندا.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation.
And I'd first like to thank the UNICEF Executive Director, Catherine Russell, welcome her to the Chamber, and thank her and Under Secretary General Griffiths for their briefings today. Your messages were really, really stark, but we need to hear them. The international community needs to hear the facts. We commend the vital work of all humanitarians in Ukraine. And today, on the eve of International Women's Day, I salute the courage of all women working on the ground in Ukraine to save lives. The safety and security of all those brave individuals must be ensured. Madam President, one of the youngest fleeing over the weekend was a 2-month-old boy called Andrei, who crossed the border from Ukraine into Poland. As his Aunt Valentina comforted Andrei and his mother, she told UNHCR, "I never thought I would have to leave my home, that I would have to flee just to save my life." The Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine has now created nothing short of a humanitarian catastrophe. As a brutal war is waged, we are seeing little to no regard for the safety of civilians. Andrei and Valentina represent just 2 of the 1.7 million people who have become refugees in less than 2 weeks. "We gathered some things and fled," Valentina said. She had reason to. We now know that something in the order of 12 million people are in need of assistance. Thousands have been killed and injured, the human cost mounting by the day. A humanitarian catastrophe simply of tragic proportion. In densely populated cities, in villages and towns, Ukrainian civilians are forced to shelter for safety in underground car parks and metro stations. Their daily lives upended, everything on hold, terrorized. All the while, the use of explosive weapons destroy their homes and the civilian infrastructure they rely on for survival. We are hearing reports hourly of multiple attacks on medical facilities, including maternity and children's hospitals, even oncology clinics, all protected under international humanitarian law. We have looked on in horror as attempts to evacuate the estimated 200,000 people from Mariupol have failed. The ICRC has been clear. Whatever is agreed or not agreed on humanitarian corridors or other measures, civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. This applies both to those who choose to leave and to those who choose to remain. That's a core obligation under international humanitarian law. Each chilling violation of international law evokes the darkest days of Europe's past. President, the humanitarian consequences of damage to civilian infrastructure is not abstract. It means interrupted supplies of electricity, critical for the continuing functioning of hospitals and essential services. It means heating homes. It means enabling parents cook to feed their children. The Children's Hospital where Valentina worked as a volunteer was hit by artillery at the beginning of the invasion. As she looked at her nephew, she recalled the children she saw killed in that attack. She says simply, they were so small. Ireland calls on the Russian Federation to uphold its international obligations. That includes protecting civilian healthcare facilities and protecting medical and humanitarian personnel. All parties must also facilitate safe passage and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance, including medical and food supplies to those in need. A notification system and emergency helpline should be established to facilitate delivery of humanitarian aid. Ireland reiterates our call at last Friday's meeting for the immediate cessation of military activity by Russia against and at Ukraine's nuclear facilities in order to avert nuclear disaster and the subsequent humanitarian consequences. We note that over the weekend, the IAEA expressed grave concern at the situation at the Zaporizhzhia plant. President, as Ms. Russell so clearly set out for us today, the women and children of Ukraine are in the midst of a desperate protection crisis. The terror of war and the trauma of family separation will have lifelong effects on thousands of Ukrainian children. They will be marked forever by these days. As in all conflicts around the world, women and girls are especially vulnerable to the abhorrent scourge of sexual violence, sexual exploitation and abuse. All women and girls in Ukraine must be protected from rape and sexual violence. We will work to ensure that there will be no place to hide from accountability for anyone who perpetrates crimes against them. President, in the face of the massive exodus of refugees from Ukraine, we once again commend our EU partners and Moldova for their continued generosity and solidarity. They are welcoming vulnerable people seeking to leave Ukraine without discrimination. We appeal to all countries in the region to keep their borders open to all those seeking safety and protection. Ireland is fully committed to supporting the humanitarian response, both domestically and in the region. The humanitarian impact of this war will be felt not just on the European continent. It will affect the food security situation in countries heavily reliant on Ukrainian agricultural products in Africa, in Asia, and in the Middle East, reminding us at this table once again of the inherent links between conflict and hunger. President, Ireland once again urges the Russian Federation to immediately cease hostilities, unconditionally withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and to refrain from further threat of force or use of any kind of force against Ukraine or any other member state. Andrei and his family speak to the human face of this reprehensible conflict. Before any more lives are ruined or lost to this war, before more children die, before more families are separated, before it's too late, we plead one more time with the Russian Federation to choose dialogue and diplomacy over bombs and bullets. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. And may I start by thanking too Martin Griffiths and Cathy Russell for their sobering briefings. I also want to add my thanks and appreciation for the work of your organisations, the courage of your staff, and the integrity of your reporting. Madam President, Martin, Cathy and colleagues have already described in sobering detail the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. 1.7 million refugees, 1.7 million individual lives destroyed, and the UN expects this to rise to 4 million in the coming weeks. We've seen the devastation caused by Russian missiles and bombardment, including reports of cluster munitions in Russian cities. in Ukrainian cities, apartment blocks torn apart, hospitals, schools in ruins, people left without electricity, food, water, and shelter. We can't turn the clock back. Russia's invasion has been met with fierce resistance by the Ukrainian people. In response, President Putin is directing a campaign of violence and cruelty against civilians. But let me be clear, we will hold Russia to account for its actions, and we will investigate thoroughly allegations of war crimes and violations of international law. Madam President, in response to this tragedy, the UK Prime Minister today announced a further $130 million of aid, which brings to a total the UK's support for Ukraine to $520 million. In addition, individual members of the British public have given over $130 million. This is intended to help Ukrainians in need and support neighbouring countries receive refugees. But as I've said before, what the Ukrainian people really need is an end to this invasion. So we appeal to Russia to end their war before they bring even more tragedy to the Ukraine and even more shame on their own nation. Vasily Alexeyevich, the great Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, "Man is given not only one life, but also a conscience." I know that you've spoken under instructions today, but I ask you to report faithfully back to Moscow what you have heard today, the urgency of this Council's calls for peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President.
Agradezco las presentaciones de la directora ejecutiva
I wish to thank
Rosso
Executive
y del
Director
Secretario
Russell
General
and
Griffiths.
Undersecretary Griffiths
Como
for their
nos
briefings.
han informado, la
As they have
situación
informed us,
humanitaria en
the
Ucrania,
humanitarian situation
a 11
in
días del
Ukraine,
inicio del conflicto,
11 days
requiere de una
after
acción
the conflict
urgente
started,
y coordinada
calls
con la
for urgent
participación
coordinated
de
action
actores
with the
humanitarios
participation of
imparciales.
impartial humanitarian
El
actors.
reto es enorme.
The challenge is enormous.
Hoy son ya 1.7
Today,
millones de refugiados.
1.7 million refugees are the number, which will
internos,
continue to increase.
y seguramente
There is
muchos
approximately
más que
1
desean
million
hacerlo, pero que aún no
internally
han podido
displaced
ser evacuados.
people and
Y
a
la
lot more
mayoría,
who wish to
como
be
hemos
evacuated
escuchado,
but have not yet been able to
son
leave.
mujeres
And
y niños.
the majority, as we have heard, are women and children.
A esto se suman
Along
otras
with
agravantes
this,
que se han presentado en los últimos
other
días,
exacerbating factors have
de las cuales
arisen
también nos
in
han
recent
informado,
days, which we
como son las
also have
críticas
heard about,
condiciones de
such as
acceso
the critical
a agua y
conditions of
alimentos
access to
en
water
ciudades
and food
sitiadas.
in cities under siege.
Llamamos con urgencia
We
a una
urgently call
pausa sostenida de
for
las
a
hostilidades.
sustained
La ayuda
pause
humanitaria
of hostilities.
no puede ni debe ser
Humanitarian
rehén
assistance
de
must
consideraciones
not be
políticas
held
o de
hostage
ataques militares.
by
Se
political
debe
considerations
garantizar
or
el
military
acceso
attacks.
irrestricto y seguro de
The
todos los
unrestricted,
trabajadores
safe
humanitarios
access
en
for
Ucrania
all
y en
humanitarian
todos los países
workers
colindantes
in
de conformidad
Ukraine must be
con el derecho
guaranteed,
internacional humanitario.
as well as in all neighboring countries, in
Igualmente,
accordance with
se debe
international
cumplir con lo dispuesto en
humanitarian
la
law.
resolución
Likewise,
2573
the provisions
en
of
relación
Resolution
con la protección de
2573
civiles,
must be
de los
complied
bienes
with when
indispensables
it
para
comes
su
to the protection
supervivencia
of
y de
civilians,
la infraestructura
the goods
imprescindible
needed for their
para la entrega
survival,
de la ayuda humanitaria.
and the essential infrastructure for
Recordamos
the
también
delivery of humanitarian
que en dicha
assistance.
resolución el
We also
Consejo de
recall that
Seguridad
in the
fue
aforementioned
claro al
resolution,
exigir que todas las partes en
the
los
Security
conflictos
Council
armados
was clear when it
establezcan
required that
una
all parties
pausa
to armed
humanitaria
conflicts establish a humanitarian pause to facilitate the safe, unrestricted, and sustained delivery of the assistance needed, as well as the provision of connected services by impartial humanitarian agents following the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence, in accordance with international law, including the applicable provisions of international humanitarian law and refugee law. I wish to stress 4 aspects related to the action on the ground. First, the use of cluster munitions under any circumstances is unconscionable. They have a devastating impact on the civilian population, especially after the conflict is over. We call for a stop to the use of these munitions in Ukraine. We call on those states that have not already done so to join the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Second, the direct impact that the conflict has on the most vulnerable must be dealt with urgently. These include women, children, and the disabled. In this mass exodus that is taking place, we are particularly concerned at the situation of unaccompanied minors. We call for the ongoing monitoring mechanisms to have a gender focus and take into account the situation of children. And for this reason, we recognize and support the participation of UNICEF. Third, the establishment of an immediate humanitarian pause is essential to guarantee the access of humanitarian workers, as well as the establishment of routes to evacuate civilians and safe transit routes. Attacks on those seeking refuge are against humanitarian law. And fourthly, the immediate impact of the conflict is multidimensional. Thus, humanitarian assistance must include the provision of mental health and psychosocial support services. Madam President, with France, we will insist on consultations for the Security Council to adopt a resolution which is broadly humanitarian in nature and will deal with the points that were discussed at this meeting. It is urgent for the Council to resume its role as the main body responsible for international peace and security. We hope that both this meeting and the following consultations will serve to advance dialogue and make it possible to bring positions closer together and reach agreements with only one goal in mind: to help those who urgently need humanitarian assistance. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, I thank Mr. Griffiths and Ms. Russell for their briefings. What is happening before our eyes is a true humanitarian tragedy. The Russian aggression is killing civilians, including children, every day. Essential civilian infrastructures are being destroyed, hospitals and schools are attacked, the city of Mariupol is under siege, depriving its 450,000 inhabitants of water, food, heating, and electricity. Already 1.7 millions are refugees, and this is just the beginning. France hails the solidarity which European states, particularly Poland, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Moldova have demonstrated. France and its European Union partners stand firmly beside Ukraine. The European Union has announced 590 million euros of humanitarian assistance. France also does its part. We have announced 100 million euro and already sent over 100 tons of humanitarian aid. The priority is an immediate cessation of hostilities and the full respect of international humanitarian law. This is the reason for the commitment of President Macron. It is also the message that all peoples of the world are sending, as was shown during the demonstrations for peace during the weekend. More and more Russians also express their opposition to a war they do not want, despite the attempts to muzzle them. It is essential to protect civilians, including children and humanitarian personnel, as well as civilian infrastructure. The permanent representative of the Russian Federation wished to bring up the implementation of humanitarian corridors, and he has shown drafts for this to President Macron. Let me cite what President Macron said a few hours ago. Humanitarian corridors, let us be clear, are a possibility of allowing men and women to leave. Russia is advocating humanitarian corridors towards Russia. I don't know of too many Ukrainians who wish to seek refuge in Russia. This is hypocrisy. This is why France and Mexico are working on a resolution calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the full respect of international humanitarian law. As Mr. Griffiths and Ms. Russell suggested, this Council must take its full responsibility and put an end to this tragedy. It must be possible for people who are trying to flee Ukraine to do so safely and without obstruction. Ukraine has made commitments on this front. The protection of civilians and humanitarian access must be guaranteed throughout the territory, both for the civilians who can leave and those who remain behind. Madam President, we call on Russia to act in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and respect international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. Light must be shed on the allegations of crimes which must not go unpunished if they are proven. This is why France supports the International Criminal Court and the Commission of Inquiry created by the Human Rights Council. France hails the courage shown by the people of Ukraine. Within the United Nations and in every international body, France will continue to mobilize with its partners to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. I join others in thanking Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell for their briefings. The worsening situation in Ukraine and ensuing humanitarian crisis deserve our immediate and urgent attention. As per the UN estimates, more than 1.5 million refugees have sought shelter in neighboring countries of Ukraine over the last 11 days. This has led to a pressing humanitarian crisis that needs to be addressed expeditiously. Numerous civilian lives have been lost so far, which also includes a young Indian student. India mourns his death, and we convey our deepest condolences to his family, just as we mourn the loss of each and every civilian life in the conflict. India has been consistent in calling for an immediate end to all hostilities. Our Prime Minister once again spoke to the leadership of both sides today and reiterated our call for immediate ceasefire and the need for both parties to return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy. We have also reiterated our urgent demand for safe and uninterrupted passage for all innocent civilians, including Indian nationals remaining in Ukraine. We are deeply concerned that despite our repeated urgings to both sides, the safe corridor for our students stranded in Sumy did not materialize. We have managed to facilitate the safe return of over 20,000 Indians from Ukraine. We have also assisted nationals from other countries who approached us in their return to their respective countries, and we will remain open to doing so in the coming days. more than 80 evacuation flights have been crisscrossing the skies to bring them home. We are appreciative of the assistance rendered by the authorities of Ukraine and its neighboring countries in facilitating their return. We note the joint launch of the Flash Appeal and the Regional Refugee Response Plan by the Secretary General on Ukraine. We hope the international community will respond positively to the humanitarian needs. On its part, India has already sent 7 tranches of humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighboring countries. These include medicines, medical equipment, tents, protective eye gear, water storage tanks, solar lamps, amongst other relief material. We are in the process of identifying other such requirements and sending more supplies. Allow me to underscore that it is important that humanitarian action is always guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These should not be politicized. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of India for their statement and give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I thank the Under-Secretary General, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and the Executive Director of Unicef, Catherine Russell, for their very informative briefings. We take note of the nomination of Mr. Amin Wad as the UN coordinator for the crisis in Ukraine. Madam President, some 12 or dozen days after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we are today having the second meeting on the humanitarian situation there, which gives us information about the situation on the ground and takes account of the fact that in an armed conflict, the situation can not only develop very quickly, but that the context can alter our forecasts or our judgment of reality. I will stick to the facts. On the 24th of February, the security situation in Ukraine deteriorated. Fighting caused significant loss of human life, and almost 1 million people had to leave Ukrainian territory to seek refuge in neighboring countries. There was massive displacement of people in particularly difficult, cold conditions. These people were therefore exposed to urgent needs for food, water, and other basic products. Furthermore, damage and destruction of civilian infrastructure in the combat zones and those affected by airstrikes and bombing are such that they prevent the population from accessing water, food, healthcare, and other basic services. We are particularly concerned by the damage caused to civilians, to women and children. UNICEF believes that there are several million people who are in danger. My country maintains its solidarity with the population that is suffering and with all the people who are facing the consequences of this war, and invites the parties to create safe, unrestricted paths out of Ukrainian territory. We call on the warring factions to facilitate the quick, safe and unimpeded access of humanitarian aid to the people who need it. We call for protection for civilians, including humanitarian personnel and vulnerable people, in particular women, older people, people with disabilities and children, in line with the Geneva Convention. We welcome the important multifaceted action from the international community, which is reflected in the donations in kind and in financing, as well as bilateral and multilateral partnerships, including from the World Bank and the IMF. From the beginning of the crisis, they have activated their rapid financing mechanisms and have promised $3 billion, some 550 million of which in the very short term to support Ukraine. This is a support. There's also the support from the United Nations. We also express our appreciation for the spirit and the generosity of the countries neighboring Ukraine. They have demonstrated exemplary altruism in hosting refugees fleeing the fighting. Here, I would like to recall the humanity of everyone and appeal to that so that the same reception is offered to all people who are suffering, regardless of race, and this includes nationals from Africa and African students whose distress is no less in this situation of confusion and terror. We call for their dignity to be respected and for equal treatment of all people who are suffering. Indeed, information is coming to us from different sources, and time and again it tells us that there is discrimination and that African students are kept in risky areas. This is a concerning situation and a morally unsustainable one that must be vigorously denounced. Madam President, my country calls on the warring factions to respect the provisions of international humanitarian law, in particular the Geneva Convention of 1949 and its additional protocols, to guarantee the respect and protection for all medical personnel and humanitarian workers. Gabon welcomes the establishment of humanitarian corridors for civilians to leave combat zones and calls on the parties to the conflict to do all to achieve an immediate ceasefire. I wish to reiterate the position that Gabon clearly expressed in the General Assembly, namely that this situation cannot end without an immediate and a lasting solution being found to end the fighting. This would entail all of the parties committing to negotiations in good faith, with the firm will to end the conflict and to remove all the deep-rooted causes of it. In conclusion, I call on the members of this Council to take every possibility that diplomacy offers us to find a negotiated settlement and to prevent an escalation of hostilities. In African culture, when two people from the same village come to blows, it falls to their relatives, their neighbours and their friends to arbitrate and to make an investment in finding peace. Experience has often found or shown that the earlier friends and loved ones get involved, the earlier calm returns. And whenever the people around the two who are having a disagreement take sides, it makes the situation worse. Of course, once calm is re-established, it is always possible to establish who is responsible in holistic fashion, calmly. And it is in line with this Bantu wisdom from Africa that I wish to reiterate to all of the parties our call for an immediate ceasefire and for de-escalation. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Gabon for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Madam President, let me thank you for convening this meeting and express my appreciation for USG Griffiths and Executive Director Russell for their briefings and their efforts in minimizing the human suffering in this tragic conflict. Brazil reiterates its grave concern with the humanitarian situation arising from the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. First and foremost, we urge all parties to establish a ceasefire and engage in negotiations. The current situation can only bring more suffering and losses, especially in Ukraine, but potentially to the whole region. While hostilities continue, we call on all parties to fully respect international humanitarian law, including when resorting to new military technologies and cyber means. Parties must always uphold the principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution, and humanity. Brazil urges the parties to continue to establish humanitarian pauses and to create humanitarian corridors. We echo, nonetheless, the ICRC's concerns regarding the need to respect international humanitarian rules both for those who choose to leave and for those who remain. The rules of war are not optional. We insist on our call for safe, timely, and unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance to those in need, particularly the most vulnerable. We remind the plea echoed by many member states for neighboring countries to keep borders open to refugees without any kind of discrimination. Brazil reiterates its gratitude and solidarity to Poland Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, and others who are facilitating the exit and reception of refugees. Madam President, when the lines between combatants and civilians become blurred, we risk seeing a rise in civilian casualties, especially in armed conflicts fought in urban areas when explosive weapons are used in these contexts. In the worst cases, children may suffer the direst consequences of armed conflicts. Children in Ukraine must be protected from the dangers of war and under no circumstances should be recruited, used, or allowed to join any military activity or take any direct part in hostilities. Attacks against civilian infrastructures, especially schools and medical facilities, as well as water and sanitation system, must be avoided. Parties must respect the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child in its entirety. Furthermore, no additional hardship should be imposed over the affected populations and vulnerable groups through broad economic sanctions. Children forced to flee their homes to ensure their own survival are especially vulnerable. The increasing number of internally displaced children in Ukraine and refugee children in neighboring countries will require support from the international community. From our side, following the swift establishment of a humanitarian visa policy for those fleeing the conflict, which entered into force on March 3rd, Brazilian embassies in Bratislava, Bucharest, Budapest, Prague, and Warsaw have started to grant special visas for displaced Ukrainians and stateless persons for humanitarian reception purposes. Madam President, a few days ago, the General Assembly sent a political message urging immediate peaceful resolution of the conflict. This is a strong call of the international community for peace. Now, the Security Council must play its part and genuinely contribute for a peaceful solution to this crisis. Garnering consensus in this Council around basic humanitarian messages is imperative. We must work collectively to widen humanitarian corridors and assistance and to open also the path for dialogue and diplomacy, guided by international law and the principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil, and I give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank USG Martin Griffiths and Executive Director Catherine Russell for their briefings, and I thank you for your work. I also welcome the participation of the distinguished permanent representative of Ukraine. Madam President, the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation in Ukraine is gravely concerning. Kenya offers its condolences to the families who have lost loved ones to the conflict in the last few days. Kenya also commends Ukraine's neighbors for opening their borders to refugees of multiple nationalities. We urge them to ensure that the protection sought are offered with no discrimination on the basis, and particularly in regard to race or religion. Madam President, we are disturbed by the reported widespread damage to civilian objects and infrastructure. Kenya draws to the attention of the parties the need for them to comply with Security Council Resolution 2573 on protection of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population that was adopted by this Council in 2021. Madam President, Ukraine is a major producer of agricultural products that are key to assuring food security. The humanitarian impact of this conflict will be felt far beyond Ukraine because of the shock to the global food supply. Indeed, the closure of its ports as a result of the conflict, not to mention the destruction of infrastructure, is going to result in few grain and fertilizer exports. The resulting sharp prices increase are likely to plunge multiple countries into food insecurity and, as a result, possible political turmoil. In addition to Ukraine's key place in global food supply system being impacted by the conflict, the world will also suffer greatly from the unilateral and regional sanctions against the Russian Federation. We have previously urged that humanitarian and legal consideration be given to the impact on the Russian people of these sanctions. Now we must add our concern for the many, including in our own country, who will suffer all over the world. While the sanctions are aimed at responding to the inexcusable armed breach of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity by the Russian Federation, they will end up harming not only the innocent in Russia, but also millions around the world, particularly in the global south. In this regard, I have two questions for USG Griffiths. First, would you make public your assessments on the impact of the armed conflict in Ukraine and the sanctions against the Russian Federation on the humanitarian situation in other countries, particularly in regard to food security? Second, what are the preventive actions that can be taken by the UN and the Security Council to ensure that the shock to the global food supply system does not translate to new crises? I wish to welcome the joint commitment by Ukraine and Russian Federation to establish humanitarian corridors for the safe passage of civilians and humanitarian supplies. However, during this past weekend, the humanitarian corridors have failed. We hope that the humanitarian corridors, particularly from Sumy, will be open to all foreign nationals and civilians tomorrow. Civilians and foreign nationals are not party to the conflict and must be protected at all times. They are not and must not be a target. We strongly urge both parties to ensure their safe passage. We commend the United Nations and its partner agencies for their continued efforts to provide humanitarian assistance. In particular, we welcome the identification of 4 humanitarian hubs in Lviv, Vinnytsia, Uzhhorod, and Geneva. Ultimately, Madam President, the only way out of this crisis is for a ceasefire and dialogue to protect Ukrainian sovereignty and shape a stable European security order. I close by reiterating Kenya's recognition of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank you for convening today's session. I would also like to express my delegation's appreciation to the Unicef Executive Director, Ms. Catherine Russell, for highlighting the impact that the conflict has had on children in Ukraine. Let me also thank Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths for the updated situational report on the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Ghana is alarmed at the exponentially high levels of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine since this Council's first consideration of the matter on February 28 this year. At the time, it was reported that about 100,000 people were displaced, as some 500,000 more attempted to flee from shelling of heavy artillery, missiles, and airstrikes in the cities. Today, and only a week later, nearly 1,200 casualties have been recorded since the start of the conflict. 1.7 million people have fled the cities of Ukraine to neighboring countries, and some 160,000 have been internally displaced. What remains unchanged, however, are the principles and the responsibility to ensure the protection of all persons suffering under the weight of the raging conflict in Ukraine. We must therefore uphold the legitimacy of the international norms of the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols that require of conflicting parties a duty to preserve the sanctity of human life by taking necessary precautions to spare the lives of civilians and avoid the destruction of civilian infrastructure during the time of war. All member states are duty-bound to comply with their international law obligations, international humanitarian law, and human rights law. Failure to do so constitutes serious violations which cannot and must not be ignored. It is regrettable that the agreement reached between the two sides for the creation of humanitarian corridors for safe evacuations and the safe passage of food and medicines did not hold. We join other members of this Council in reiterating the call for a humanitarian pause to allow the evacuation of civilians, especially in the cities of Mariupol and Kharkiv, where intense military operations are ongoing. We call for the immediate cessation of hostilities in residential and civilian populated areas. It is also vital that agreements are reached to allow windows of silence that will enable the safe and unhindered passage of humanitarian convoys to all areas where civilians remain in need of water, food, and medical care. Ghana further supports the United Nations ask for the urgent establishment of a notification system and an emergency hotline with both the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian government to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid and life-saving supplies. Moreover, we are compelled to reiterate the absolute importance for the parties to steer away the military hostilities from all nuclear installations in Ukraine to avoid the risk of a nuclear disaster. We urge the IAEA to continue to monitor activities within Ukraine's nuclear program and operationalize preventive mechanisms to avert any accidental occurrences. We take note of the complex environment within which the humanitarian agencies are operating and commend them for their commitment. We also acknowledge those member states and international institutions which have contributed to the humanitarian fund required to ensure adequate humanitarian response. We are disheartened by the trauma and the suffering that children in Ukraine are experiencing during this period. These are the succeeding generations we pledge to save from the scourge of war. We commend Unicef for its active engagement in the humanitarian operations and encourage the humanitarian agencies in their effort to address the peculiar vulnerabilities of children, as well as the women, the aged, and persons with disabilities. Madam President, I wish to take this opportunity to commend the neighboring countries of Ukraine and other European countries who have opened their borders to offer refuge to persons fleeing the conflict. We continue to prevail on them in their efforts to be guided by the principles of humanity and neutrality, impartiality, and independence. In closing, Madam President, I must re-echo the call upon the Russian Federation to end the aggression against the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine and withdraw its military forces. We firmly believe that military options will not deliver the mutual demands of security between Russian Federation and Ukraine. As the humanitarian situation in Ukraine worsens, economic ramifications are already being felt globally. We hope that this Council will take a unified path to support efforts to resolve the conflict through diplomacy and dialogue. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. Let me begin by thanking the briefers for their sobering account on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, particularly for outlining the terrifying ordeal many children are facing. We are seriously concerned by the staggering numbers of civilian casualties in Ukraine. Children have been killed and wounded. Children have lost their homes. Let me underline that Russia, and Russia alone, bears the sole responsibility for this humanitarian crisis. The Russian aggression against Ukraine must stop now. Troops must be withdrawn immediately. Civilians, including children, and civilian infrastructure must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. we are deeply concerned by the reported use of cluster munition by Russian forces in Ukraine. These are inherently indiscriminate weapons. They continue to kill and injure children long after conflict ends. Children are traumatized as they seek shelter from the bombing and shelling, forced to flee across Ukraine and across borders, putting them at risk of sexual and gender-based violence. We are deeply concerned about unaccompanied children separated from their families. Every effort must be made to restore family links and trace missing persons. Humanitarian organizations must give priority to the assistance and protection of children affected by conflict, including the need for mental health and psychosocial support. President, Russia's warfare in urban and populated areas and the use of heavy explosive weapons is causing terrible long-term harm on civilians and cause the most severe physical harm to children, killing and maiming them. With attacks on hospitals, water processing plants, food system, and other civilian infrastructure, children are being deprived of services essential for their life and health. The fighting around nuclear plants endangers the health and safety of today's children and those of future generations in Ukraine and beyond. And schools are under attack. These attacks represent a clear violation of a Resolution 2601 on the protection of education in armed conflict, which this Council unanimously adopted only a few months ago. We call on the Russian Federation to respect the civilian characters of schools and educational facilities in accordance with international humanitarian law. President, we stand behind and support OCHA's call today for concrete steps to be taken to ensure protection of civilians and humanitarian access. We call on the parties to the conflict to comply with their obligation under international humanitarian law to allow and facilitate safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to those in need. The space for humanitarian action must be restored and protected in a way that ensures continuous and sustained humanitarian access. Civilians must be protected at all times. Ceasefire agreements and so-called humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians can be measured for this purpose. Evacuation of civilians must be safe, voluntary, and to destination of their own choosing. Unclear agreements won't meet the needs of the civilian population. Those civilians who are leaving and also those civilians who are remaining must be protected. We commend the neighboring countries for keeping the borders open and for the great generosity and solidarity shown with people fleeing the conflict. The door to safety and protection must remain open without discrimination. We also commend all the humanitarian organizations, and in particular the local organizations, for their heroic efforts to deliver life-saving aid. Medical and humanitarian workers must be protected. They are not a target. President, Norway condemns Russia's massive military aggression against Ukraine. We reiterate our call on Russia to withdraw its troops immediately and stop causing further death, suffering, and destruction. The 7.5 million children of Ukraine are seeing the places they live, play, and learn being damaged and destroyed. Their lives and future are at stake. This war must stop now. Dialogue and diplomacy are the only way forward. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, first of all, I wish to thank USG Griffiths and Executive Director Russell for their respective briefings. We remain concerned about the rapidly changing situation in Ukraine and deeply deplore the increasing number of civilian casualties. We appeal for the maximum degree of restraint and intensification of diplomatic efforts so as to put an early end to the fight, ensure the protection of civilian life and their property and their basic needs, and prevent the emergence of a large-scale humanitarian crisis. Russia and Ukraine have reached a consensus through negotiation on the establishment of humanitarian corridors. We hope the parties will overcome the difficulties encountered in the implementation of this consensus so as to ensure that those corridors are safe and smooth. China's State Council and Foreign Minister today put forward a 6-point initiative on the situation in Ukraine. First, the humanitarian operations must strictly abide by the principle of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality in accordance with the GA Resolution 46/182 in order to prevent politicization of humanitarian issues. Second, full attention should be given to all those displaced inside and from Ukraine. Most important in particular is to provide humanitarian assistance to those countries hosting these people and to help with their proper shelter. Third is the protection of civilians, in particular, protection of vulnerable groups of women, children, elderly, and people with disability. And efforts should be made to avoid the emergence of secondary humanitarian disasters inside Ukraine, such as food shortage and the spread of infectious diseases. Fourth, efforts should be made to guarantee safe and smooth humanitarian operations, including providing rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, and ensure the safety and security of medical personnel and humanitarian personnel exclusively engaged in medical duties, and to protect the medical equipment and transportation used in humanitarian operations and critical civilian infrastructure. Fifth is to ensure the safety of foreign nationals in Ukraine, allowing their safe, guaranteed, and unrestricted departure from Ukraine, and to help them return to their home country. Sixth is to support United Nations' coordinating role in channeling humanitarian assistance in Ukraine, and to support the work of the United Nations Crisis Coordinator for Ukraine. During the course of organizing Chinese nationals seeking refuge and evacuation, we have received friendly assistance from the government and different sectors of society in Ukraine, and countries including Russia, Moldova, Romania, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Belarus have also provided valued support. Here, we wish to express our heartfelt thanks to the government and people of these countries. Madam President, that the situation in Ukraine has deteriorated to where it is today is due to a combination of complex factors. To resolve complex issues, what is required is calm and reason, rather than adding fuel to the flame, which will only lead to escalation. To resolve the crisis in Ukraine, it is imperative to abide by the principles and the purposes of the UN Charter, respect and ensure the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of countries, and to abide by the principle of indivisibility of security and address reasonable security concerns of the parties concerned. It is imperative to stick to dialogue and negotiation and find a resolution to the dispute through peaceful means. Any action that is conducive to easing the situation and a political settlement will receive China's support. Any action that is not conducive to promoting a diplomatic solution and which in essence means fanning and fueling the flame leading to escalation will be met with China's opposition. We are deeply concerned at the intensifying unilateral sanctions. Sanctions are not an effective means to finding lasting solution to the issue in question. On the contrary, they will create disastrous humanitarian consequences, and their spillover effect will only create damage and loss to other countries. Importing offensive weapons into Ukraine and sending mercenaries may further worsen the situation and create more and bigger risks. China will continue to speak for peace and to work for peace. We encourage Russia and Ukraine to continue with their direct negotiations, and we express the hope that their talks are fruitful where peace can be created. China has always been committed to creating peace through negotiations. On the second day of the conflict, in an arranged phone call with President Putin, President Xi Jinping already expressed his wish that Russia and Ukraine will hold peace talks as soon as possible, to which President Putin responded positively. China is also willing, when the time requires, to join the international community to carry out necessary good offices. We also encourage the United States, NATO, EU to carry an equal dialogue with Russia and to face up to the antagonism and problems that had been accumulating for years, and pay high attention to the negative effect to the security environment for Russia resulted from the continuous eastward expansion of NATO, and in accordance with the principle of indivisibility of security, to seek to establish a European security mechanism that is balanced, effective, and sustainable. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Arab Emirates. I would like at the outset to thank Mr. Martin Griffiths, the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Ms. Catherine Russell, Executive Director of Unicef, for their briefings. As the speakers ahead of me have noted, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine has reached catastrophic levels. Today, more than 40 million Ukrainians, including 7.5 million children, face insecurity, damaged and destroyed infrastructure, and a severe lack of basic services. As mentioned, there are nearly 1.7 million Ukrainians who are either internally displaced or refugees, while the number of casualties continues to rise. Considering these grim facts, we must, as an international community, try to urgently alleviate the humanitarian suffering of Ukrainians as we intensify our efforts to end the fighting and find a permanent solution to the current crisis. In this regard, I would like to focus on the following issues. First, we call on all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. This includes ensuring foremost that civilians and civilian objects, including schools and hospitals, are not the target of attacks. We further note that the destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure is severely affecting humanitarian conditions, with access to urgent services such as water, health services, and food supplies is increasingly difficult. Humanitarian aid must reach those in need without precondition on any ceasefire agreements. The safety of humanitarian personnel must also be ensured. We stress the need to stop hostilities, to allow affected civilians to leave cities exposed to violence, including Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Sumy. We deeply regret the collapse of the humanitarian corridors that have been agreed and recognize that humanitarian corridors are temporary and imperfect solutions. They are not an alternative to respect for international humanitarian law. However, properly established humanitarian corridors can be an immediate measure as we explore every way that can contribute to the protection of civilians. Second, there is an urgent need for realistic initiatives that can contribute to building confidence between the conflicting parties and to ensuring respect for international humanitarian law. For example, the remains of the dead should be identified and respected, and whenever possible, their return should be arranged. Protected persons, including wounded, sick, and captured soldiers, are due protection by the parties under international humanitarian law. Third, we call on the international community to intensify efforts to urgently provide humanitarian support to Ukraine. This includes contributing to the UN Humanitarian Flash Appeal and the Ukraine Regional Refugee Response Plan, as well as other initiatives. In this regard, we commend the role of the United Nations Secretariat in supporting and coordinating the humanitarian response, which should focus particularly on women and children. We also commend the efforts made by neighboring countries in receiving fleeing Ukrainians. The UAE will provide $5 million to alleviate the suffering of Ukrainians. Additionally, we sent 30 metric tons of emergency and medical and relief aid to Ukraine today. In conclusion, we stress that finding a solution to the crisis and avoiding further damage and casualties requires restraint and an immediate ceasefire throughout Ukraine. It also requires activating diplomatic channels to find a sustainable solution that ends the conflict. We welcome the continued high-level engagement of the international community with each of the parties. We believe such efforts will contribute to a diplomatic solution in a manner that serves the goal of maintaining regional and international peace and security and protects the dignity and needs of millions of civilians. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, Mr. Under-Secretary General, Madam Executive Director, 12 days of all-out Russian invasion in Ukraine, including from the territory of Belarus, have brought us on the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe of potentially global nature. I would like to thank all countries who accept the Ukrainian refugees and let other foreign nationals to their territory. As we have already heard, more than 1.7 million people, mostly women and children, have already fled from the war unleashed, unprovoked by Russia. In Sachsenhausen, in Germany, in the spring of 1942, an extermination unit was built in the industrial yard with a crematorium and a neck shot unit with a gas chamber added in 1943. The SS cynically named this building Station Z or Station Z. Z is a letter that Russian military is putting on their vehicles departing to Ukraine. Some interpret Z as za pobedu in Russian, or for victory in English. Some say it is Zapad in Russian, or West in English. I would insist it is Z for звери, or animals, or rather beasts in English. Russia continues to cynically disregard the norms of international humanitarian law during hostilities. Russian troops block numerous attempts of the Ukrainian authorities to evacuate civilians through humanitarian corridors. They denied access of international organizations to provide humanitarian assistance to the most affected places. It is even more appalling that the Russian troops open firing on evacuees and evacuation vehicles, shell the roads allocated for humanitarian corridors. For instance, they shelled depots with evacuation buses near Mariupol, blew up railway near Irpin in the Kiev region to prevent evacuation by train, destroyed the bridge on the way to Volnovakha. All the mentioned were the main routes to evacuate civilians. As it was stated today by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, I quote, "Today, in violation of the previously reached agreements, the Russian Federation yet again disrupted the opening of the humanitarian corridors for evacuation of the civilian population from the besieged cities of the suburbs of Kiev, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Kherson regions. Russia's armed forces continue bombing and missile attacks on Kiev, Mariupol, Volnovakha, Sumy, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and other cities, towns, and villages. This prevents the safe exit of humanitarian convoys carrying Ukrainian and foreign citizens, as well as delivery of medications and food." End of quote. Today, the hearings on the Ukraine's lawsuit against Russia in genocide case have been commenced at the UN International Court of Justice. As an immediate action, Ukraine appeals to the ICJ to impose the precautionary measures in this case in order to stop the bloodshed. We condemn Russia's unwillingness to fully implement the UN General Assembly resolution on aggression against Ukraine, in particular to immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine. In fact, Russia does not fully implement it, doesn't implement it at all. First of all, Russia must stop violating the ceasefire arrangements aimed at ensuring rapid, safe, and unhindered passage through humanitarian corridors. It must put an end to spreading disinformation and manipulating the lives of civilians. Evacuation through humanitarian corridors is only possible when the ceasefire regime is fully upheld. The Ukrainian side is ready for that. We also consider as inappropriate any attempts by Moscow to force civilians, both Ukrainian citizens and foreigners, in the besieged cities to flee to the territory of Russia and Belarus, taking into account high probability of provocations, in particular taking those evacuated as hostages or using them by the Russian armed forces as a human shield. It looks especially cynical when European borders are widely open for refugees from Ukraine. And I totally agree with my friend Nicola, who said it's pure hypocrisy to push Ukrainians to Belarus or to Russia. Ukraine calls on the member states to spare no effort in forcing Russia to uphold the ceasefire regime in order to open humanitarian corridors and prevent a large-scale humanitarian catastrophe. Life is very dynamic. And unfortunately, while we were sitting here and discussing our business, another appalling example of Russia's disregard of its own commitments on humanitarian corridors has taken place just now. According to available information from my capital, Russia has undermined arrangements on humanitarian corridors for tomorrow. And I regret, my dear ambassadors, all of you who called me today when discussed this business. The arrangement was made and it was broken by the Russians. Despite a route through Poltava being agreed, including with the ICRC, Russian side has already sent us a letter with routes to Russia and Belarus only. I call on the Russian side to reverse to the previously agreed routes to allow Ukrainian and foreign citizens to leave for Europe. Today, more than hundreds of Ukrainian cities and villages attacked and sieged by the aggressor state. And they are on the verge of humanitarian disaster. The population does not have access to drinking water, food, medicine, electricity, heating, and other basic necessities. Much of the environmental damage inflicted on Ukraine by the Russian invasion will likely prove irreparable in the near future. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 teaches us that the effects of nuclear accidents endure for hundreds and even thousands of years. The CO2 being released as a result of Russia's scorched earth tactics will likewise linger in the atmosphere for the long term, compounding the effects on climate change and greenhouse effect. So for Ukraine has been one of the guarantors of global food security so far. I apologize. Now this status is challenged by the Russian war against Ukraine. The implications at the global level will be catastrophic. Just a few examples. 55% of sunflower oil exported worldwide comes from Ukraine. 55%. 60% of Ukrainian agricultural products are exported through seaports. The closure of ports and the sea by the Russian army threatens the global supply chain. It means that defending Ukraine from the Russian aggression also protects the world from hunger. Given that Russian leadership attempts to conceal real losses and resolutely denies any discussions on the ways to return their soldiers' bodies, Ukraine is facing additional threat of the health crisis. We are speaking about dozens of thousands of bodies decomposing in the fields of Ukraine, bodies of the Russian soldiers. In this regard, we call on the ICRC to set up a database of fallen occupiers, prisoners of war, on the basis of the Central Investigation Agency of the ICRC, as well as to provide assistance in returning the remains of the fallen occupiers to Russia. According to the Ministry of Education, more than 211 Ukrainian schools have been damaged or destroyed by the Russian military forces since the beginning of the invasion. Thousands of Ukrainian children have been deprived from their right to education. According to the Ministry of Health of Ukraine, as of March 6, 34 hospitals were destroyed. The World Health Organization has reported that 6 Ukrainian doctors were killed and 11 wounded as a result of the Russian shellings. Given the threat of bombing and shelling, hospitals and maternity wards have moved their patients to the basements. The country is running low on critical medical supplies. Therefore, we call on all the UN humanitarian missions to act decisively to respond to the growing humanitarian crisis without delay. Yesterday, our occupants completely destroyed the city airport of Vinnytsia. It must be noted that the Assistant Secretary General, UN Crisis Coordinator for Ukraine, Amin Awad, announced that Vinnytsia was prepared to be a main hub to all UN humanitarian missions. Distinguished members of the Security Council, the Russian occupiers are killing Ukrainian children, consciously and cynically. At least 38 children have been already killed since Russia's full-scale armed aggression against Ukraine. More than 70 kids were seriously wounded. Due to the ongoing shelling of civilian infrastructure in many cities, this number may be increasing right now. Ukraine deeply regrets that more than 2,000 citizens of India, China, Turkey, Pakistan, and other countries suffer today along with Ukrainians from Russian aggression. The government of Ukraine is in 24/7 contact with diplomatic missions and consulates of foreign countries to ensure that their citizens can safely return to their countries as soon as possible. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine has established an emergency hotline for foreign citizens wishing to leave Ukraine because of the Russian armed aggression. The Ukrainian border guards, in cooperation with colleagues from neighboring EU countries and Moldova, are doing everything possible to speed up the passage of all refugees from Ukraine and have never created obstacles that would hinder this. We would like to reiterate that the only root cause of ongoing massive humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, including the situation at the western border of Ukraine, is the armed aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Russia bears full responsibility for the killing and injuring of innocent people, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and obstacles for the safe departure of Ukrainians and foreign citizens. The government of Ukraine works 24/7 to set up the mechanisms for reliable supplies of food, medications, and essential commodities throughout the country. On the 2nd of March, President Zelensky established the Coordination Office on Humanitarian and Social Issues. Ukraine has received more than 3,500 tons of humanitarian aid, and we are grateful to all our partners for this manifestation of support. Despite enemy attacks, all systems ensuring the proper functioning of the state are intact. There is undeniable stability in the work of the Ukrainian government. Despite the war, Ministry of Social Policy and Pension Fund have paid all pensions to almost 13 million retired citizens of Ukraine. The government prepared an assistance program for all Ukrainians who have lost their jobs as a result of war. Private businesses and employees who lost jobs due to war will receive financial support in March. Ukrainian railways started procuring food, fuel, medicines, electricity, and other important goods and services for the population. The enterprise will be in close contact with military administrations and to address the most pressing needs of people and the state. Dear colleagues, in Ukraine, people in Ukraine value the words of support. At the same time, they require concrete actions to save their lives, their health, their property. It is also already clear to everyone that the fragility of the situation reaches beyond Ukraine, into Europe and across the world. We expect that the Council to be decisive in responding to the worst humanitarian crisis we have ever seen since the end of the Second World War in Europe. Before I conclude, one of my colleagues, after the last Security Council session, said, the colleague said, it looks like a group therapy. We are all here trying to bring to sanity one member. And indeed, when I listen to this member, to this representative of that country, I think it's absolutely right that the Department of Health of the City of New York is called Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Because it's very difficult after these meetings where we listen to the persistent lies and delirium coming from that particular country. I think that it's not only the Russian diplomats in New York who need mental assistance, but also those who posted today this text. Foreign Minister Lavrov, the goal of Russia's special military operation is to stop any war that could take place on Ukrainian territory or that could start from there. Russian embassy in London, retweeted by the Russian Foreign Ministry. Let me remind the Russian diplomats that in London, in case of need for mental help, you can dial NHS line 111. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. The representative of the Russian Federation is asking for the floor. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I take the floor not to polemicize with the representative of Ukraine. I have another objective, although, of course, I have some words to say. The Ukrainian representative interpreted the letter Z on Russian military hardware that is now in Ukraine as beast or a wild animal. We have our opinion about who the animals are. The representatives of the armed forces in the Ukrainian armed forces who for 8 years have terrorized the civilian population in Donbass, and this is continuing. Of course, now they are bombarding Lugansk and other regions in the Donbass. We are accused of breaking off the operation to evacuate people through the humanitarian corridors. But everything is actually quite the contrary. It's the Ukrainians who won't agree to our proposals on a ceasefire and won't allow people to exit through these corridors, even though we've already said that these national battalions are holding people hostage in these towns. They're like human shields. They're putting military technology in accommodation parks. There was also a post on Telegram about an issue related to this, about trying to use the M23, the national battalions. Azov were bombarding citizens, civilians. This is all on available. I asked for the floor in order to tell you that I have a report about a meeting of the Coordination Committee on Humanitarian Affairs in Ukraine. I won't read it out completely. We will broadcast this statement in the near future among members of the Security Council. But it says that the Russian party is once again saying that tomorrow, the 8th of March, at 10 in the morning in Moscow time, to carry out a ceasefire and to open humanitarian corridors to evacuate citizens from Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkov, and Mariupol. My Ukrainian colleagues said that Ukraine is ready to work in this direction. But let's see what answer we get to this proposal from the Russian authorities. Incidentally, this proposal doesn't have any demands about the citizens being sent necessarily to Russia, to Russian territory. There's also evacuation offered towards Ukrainian cities to the west of Kiev. And ultimately, it will be the choice of the people themselves where they want to be evacuated to. But I don't want to comment on the last statement by the representative of Ukraine. I simply don't really know how it is that he is so familiar with the authorities that deal with mental health here. I'd like to know about that in more detail. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I will now adjourn the meeting so that the Council can continue its discussion on the subject in closed consultations. I would kindly ask all observers to promptly exit the chamber directly upon the adjournment of the meeting. The meeting is adjourned.